You're listening to Period Story, the podcast where we get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods. We chat with women about their period story, their first period, and their journey ever since, and we open up a conversation to help break taboos and stigmas around menstruation. I'm your host, Lanice Brothers. I'm a registered nutritionist, women's health, hormone, and menstrual cycle coach, and the founder of Eat, Love, Move, a nutrition and well-being practice. Welcome to today's guest. On today's episode, we have Karen Arthur, a 57-year-old woman flourishing through menopause. She is a fashion designer, sewing tutor, stylist, and speaker with a bit of modeling thrown in for variety. Karen enables women to harness the power of fashion to support good mental well-being through the hashtag #WearYourHappy on social media. She's penned an ebook called 8 Ways to Wear Your Happy as a helpful guide. Karen speaks publicly on fashion and mental well-being, aging, and loneliness. Finally, Karen is also a co-founder of Craft Moves, a social initiative committed to ending loneliness amongst London's commuters through handheld craft. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so happy to have you on the show. So let's start off by getting into the story of your first period. Can you share with us what happened?
Yeah. So I was 14 and I went to the loo as normal and sat down and looked in my panties and realised, and in the toilet itself, and realised there was blood there, and I panicked and I screamed for my mother. We'd never had these conversations. We never talked about periods. I just knew it had something to do with being pregnant. So I have younger siblings, 2 boys, 2 brothers and a sister. And of course they came running as well, but I wouldn't let them in. I just wanted my mum to come in. And she got scrabbled around and got a massive pad for me, which she's told me to put in my knickers, which I hated wearing because it made me look like I just walked like I'd just gotten off a horse. And so I think my sister had asked one of my brothers what was going on, and he'd said something like, "Oh, it's something to do with being pregnant." So that would have been fine, except that the next day when I went into school, everybody thought that I was pregnant because my sister had told everyone that I was pregnant because I'd had my period. She didn't understand. I didn't understand. My first experience was actually quite scary, if anything, because it just felt so. I felt like I was a grown-up. But at the same time, I didn't feel that way. I knew it was something to do with growing up, but not a lot else. That's my first experience.
And how old did you say you were?
So I was 14 years old, just coming up to my 14th birthday. And I realised that my mother was 14 when she started her period. I think my sister was as well, and both my daughters were.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Mm.
And you said that your sister went into school and told everyone that you were pregnant. How did you feel about that?
Well, I was shocked at first, but then I realised it was quite funny. She was tiny. She was like, what is it? What's the difference between us? So she would have been about 8. She didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going on. And I don't think anybody took her seriously. So, yeah, it was fine.
You had that first experience, which you said was a little scary. And how did you learn about what was actually going on? How did you learn that you weren't actually pregnant?
I talked to my friends. I read books. We certainly didn't learn it at school. Definitely did not learn it. Our sex education was the teacher showing us a picture of a video of a woman giving birth and basically saying, just putting me off ever having sex at all. I learned through chatting to my friends. I had 2 worldly friends, Joy and Catherine. I knew everything there was to know about sex way before I even ventured there. And they'd been having their periods since they were about 11 or 12, which in those days, we're talking early 70s, was unusual. I understand it's more common for young women to have their periods in primary school, but in those days that was not a thing. And I know that certainly my two worldly friends had started their periods quite early.
So you're learning through your friends. If you think back to what you learned and then thinking about what you know now, was there any big myths that they were sharing, or do you think everything that they were talking about was basically correct?
No, I don't. I think we didn't talk a lot about it because I was squeamish. We didn't talk about these things. You didn't mention it was blood and it was embarrassing and it was, we didn't have a long conversation about it. It was just that they reassured me that I couldn't possibly be pregnant because I wasn't the Virgin Mary and I hadn't had sex. So that was that really. In terms of it being truthful, the biggest myth I got from them wasn't about periods. It was about getting pregnant, and that they said they disabused me of the notion that if you sit on a toilet seat after a boy's been in there, that you wouldn't get pregnant, because I thought that was a thing until I was in second year.
Why do you think you were so squeamish and so embarrassed?
Because, like most things to do with women, we didn't talk about it. It was taboo. You didn't. So my father was a preacher, so that wasn't happening. We weren't having conversations about bodily fluids and anything really. He left around the same time anyway, and you just didn't talk about it. No one spoke about it. It's like menopause, same thing. You just didn't talk amongst yourselves. It was like a little secret, like a taboo secret. Certainly, my mother and I never discussed it. I remember buying those little Lillet tampons, cute little things they are, thinking, I'll try one of those. And I read in Jackie that you couldn't lose your virginity by putting a tampon up your bits. So I tried it. It was so painful. My goodness me. My goodness. I thought they were the devil. So I used pads for ages. It was pads all the way for me.
You didn't really learn about menstrual health in school. You said the school didn't really teach it. You spoke to your friends and you kind of got a cursory knowledge of what was happening. But you also said that you had read some books. What were the books that you had read at the time?
Now I think about it, they won't have been books, will they? They will have been magazines. I was heavily into Jackie. The problem page. I learnt a lot of my things to do with relationships, sex, and periods through the problem page. But it was usually around shame. So it was girls who'd worn white and had a leak and what to do, that kind of thing. So it was. So when I think about it, if I did read a book, no, it will have been magazines. Now I think about it, yeah.
You mentioned the word shame. Why do you think and you've also said that people didn't talk about it. It was embarrassing. It was shameful. What does that mean for you? Like, I've talked about shame a bit with other women on this podcast. What does that word mean for you? And how would you kind of unpack those feelings now?
I would say that growing up, anything to do with women or my body was something that I wouldn't discuss. And it meant that when it came to, it was just a giggle. Like if you talked about things like this, it was funny. You made a joke out of it to kind of lighten the mood. It meant I took it into my relationships, actually. It meant that I never asked my partner to go and get me tampons or pads. I wasn't in the greatest of relationships, I will say. It meant that I never wanted to let anybody know that I was, having my period. It meant that I didn't really understand myself as much as I do now. And I will say that going into teaching and going into the pastoral side and having to learn and be a step ahead of the kids that I was teaching about sex and periods and that kind of thing, while I was a head of year with at a girls' school, head of year at a boys' school, and having two daughters has meant that I learned as much as I could. But sometimes I was teaching myself things that I should have known, I think, when I was growing up. So it made me more determined to ensure that my girls didn't grow up not knowing this stuff.
What sort of things did you have to teach yourselves? What sort of things do you think that you should have known?
I think I should have known mostly that my body isn't anything to be ashamed of. I think, I think I should have learnt about not just the anatomy stuff, giving out a worksheet with the, diagram on it and filling that in. I think it's more about how we feel as women and how powerful and important it is when you start your menstruation and what it means. It's not just about being a woman and therefore staying away from boys so that you don't get pregnant. It's much. I didn't understand the power that a period holds. And actually, I also I had periods who were I had friends who were bedridden. I had friends who had really heavy periods. I had friends who had a terrible time. Actually, my periods were, on the whole, came by clockwork and lasted 5 days, which is quite fairly, I'd have my day of eating all the carbs, forgetting that I'd have a week before where I cried if somebody looked at me. Then I'd have the day before where I would be eating all the carbs, completely forget that there was a reason for this. And then the next day my period would start and I'd be like, oh, that's why. And I'd have a day of feeling like around my abdomen and my lower back. And then I'd be fine, So I forgot the question.
You didn't really have painful periods. You had a little bit of emotional upset, like maybe a little twinge, and then it was absolutely fine.
Yeah. I would say it was just an inconvenience, if anything. But not pain like I've spoken, with my other friends and that kind of thing.
You said that you learned about the power of having a period. What does that mean for you?
The power of being a woman. When I was growing up, being a girl didn't feel like something to be celebrated. Not a girl, sorry, being a woman. I liked being a girl. But growing into womanhood wasn't really something, you didn't see anywhere where that was celebrated unless it was the way you looked, if that makes sense. So if you had an hourglass figure, or you had flat stomach, or had boobs, or long flicky hair, or that kind of thing, you were celebrated that way. That's what I saw. But in terms of the power of being able to, menstruation is a gateway to being able to give life. That's a big deal. That's a massive deal. You didn't get that at all. It was shame. You whispered it. If you were at a party or at a friend's house and you came on and you didn't have tampons or pads, it was a whisper. It's like a scrabble around to find another woman who might possibly have something that they can lend to you. I remember an awful time. I still remember it, going to a barbecue in the height of the summer, wearing white, and a woman, tapped me on the shoulder and kind of came up close behind me, and she said, "I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but I think you might have leaked." And how mortified I was that she'd noticed, which meant that somebody else probably noticed. And then worrying about and wanting to go home. And it was awful. Or staying somewhere and leaking at night, leaking onto the sheets and not knowing how to explain that, even though it's a completely natural thing to do, Awful.
Why do you think it was so mortifying? Why do you think at the time you found it so awful?
Because I'd been brought up to believe that bleeding was bad. I felt that, not brought up as in no one said that, but the messages I got were that doing something natural was a bad thing, and showing people that you were a human being and not perfect was a bad thing. So, yeah, and I was busy trying to cultivate this, I look great, I know what I'm doing, like most people do when they're in their, I don't know, well, a lot of women do all the time, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about now? How do you feel about all the changes that are happening now, and how educated and empowered people with periods, women with periods feel, and all the conversations that are happening about it?
I feel, okay, so I have two things to say about this. When I first noticed that the world was talking more about periods, and I'd see like graphics of different like people talk, especially on Instagram, so people talking about periods, people talking about their flow, that kind of thing. I won't lie, I was quite taken aback. This is 50 years, remember, of upbringing